Well, thanks everybody. Welcome to the January 3rd Thursday Web Forum for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SECAS partnership. First webinar of the new year is always really exciting, so we're very happy you're here. And as you noticed, we are kind of changing up the way that we host these web forums, and now we're going to have registration and use this Teams webinar approach. So hopefully this works a little bit better for everyone, and you're getting reminder emails and can have better access to the chat and some benefits that we hope will come from that change. So apologies for the state of my voice. I'm obviously getting over being sick, but fortunately, Mary and Analie will be doing most of the talking today. So as you probably know, SECAS hosts this web forum on the third Thursday of every month right here at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And it's an opportunity to share the latest updates on the blueprint, get input and involvement from folks like y'all. And as we're doing today, highlight exciting science and success stories in the world of landscape conservation in the Southeast and Caribbean. So as always, I'm your host. My name is Khoury Morris, and I work on user support and communications for the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. This is our agenda for today. I'll start out by introducing our speakers who will present for about 40 minutes or so. We'll have some time for Q&A and discussion at the end, and then I'll wrap up by previewing next month's webinar and sharing a couple of quick updates from your SECAS staff. So today we're going to be hearing from two folks from the Nature Conservancy's Center for Resilient Conservation Science. We have Analie Barnett, who's a landscape ecologist, and Khoury, who's a freshwater ecologist, and they're going to be telling us about a new freshwater resilience analysis that TNC has recently developed. I'm super excited to hear about that, and I should have said, you probably noticed that we are recording this web forum, and that's just so I can share that with the couple of folks who inevitably wanted to come but had a conflict, and I'll be posting the link to that recording to the calendar event on the SECAS website within a couple of days. So just a heads up that that recording's going on. With that, I think I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Mary, who's going to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Khoury. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to get my screen share going here. So we've been introduced, so I'm just going to keep moving and just say we're really happy to be here with you to talk about recent work on mapping freshwater resilience and sharing some of the tools that we've developed to make this work available. So today we're going to share, speaking about the freshwater resilience. I'm going to give background about the idea and the model, and then Analie is going to provide a couple different live demonstrations from the Resilient River Explorer tool. And we're going to share recently completed work assessing conservation status of our freshwater systems. And then we should have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. When we talk about freshwater resilience, what we're referring to is the ability of a freshwater network or a freshwater river system to sustain biodiversity, even as it is responding to the changing climate. And this need or idea for mapping resilience really is born from the recognition that we are dealing with a biodiversity crisis that is being exacerbated by climate change. And our team focused first on mapping resilient lands, and you may be familiar with that work, and was able to move to working on freshwater about 4 years ago. As we all probably know in this group, freshwater species are the most endangered species group in the U.S., and also this pattern holds globally. And it's not just a crisis of rarity and losing numbers of species, but also we have an abundance crisis. We can see that in areas where we've been able to focus a lot of conservation effort, like in wetlands, that has actually, we've seen an improvement in species abundance, but generally speaking, abundances are down across taxa groups. So to address this and to help Nature Conservancy and its partners and others focus efforts where river systems, freshwater systems are more resilient in the face of climate change, we pulled together a steering committee across all of our offices in the Conterminous U.S. And thanks to some funding from Volgina Kohler Foundation, a anonymous funder, we were able to map freshwater resilience. This is our team up here on the left-hand side, and the folks with circles around our heads, makes us look sort of like astronauts or something, are the folks who primarily developed this work. So I want to acknowledge Eric Martin, who's our developer, and Mark Anderson, who led the project, Analie, who will be talking today, and Arlene, who's another amazing spatial ecologist, who did a lot of the analysis for this work. Okay, so back to what makes a river network resilient. So large, diverse, connected networks in good ecological condition and ample unaltered water. And you might be thinking, well, that sounds like how we've thought about river integrity for a long time. And you'd be right. But what's different, I guess, or specific about this analysis is that we thought about these key attributes of freshwater systems in terms of what lends resilience to our freshwater systems given climate change, and developed a model that we were able to weight in terms of kind of what we thought were the driving factors, and also consider differences across the country. So while the components of the model are the same across the country, the weighting is different. So to the east, really, there's more emphasis on the size of the network and its complexity. And that's a little different in the west, where the presence of water is really a key factor in driving resilience. The fundamental unit is the same, and this is really where we started, and what we mapped first was the functionally connected networks across the country. And we thought about this in terms of what's the available habitat that gives species options to move and adjust and gives them, access to what they really need to persist. And now these units are really defined by where the dams are. Where are the dams that are big enough that they prevent the kind of movement that would support the resilience of biodiversity? So we can think about this unit, this is obviously a diagram to give you just a sense of this idea of like different types of habitats between dams going up into the headwaters. So we characterize those functionally connected networks in terms of these different components. And we map them actually at a finer scale than just the functional network. So a lot of this we could map, for the HUC 12. So we intersected those functionally connected networks with HUC 12s and characterized the connectivity, not just the size and complexity, but also the headwater fragmentation, and then condition in terms of the naturalness of the watershed, both in the floodplain and riparian zone and the overall watershed, a index of water quality that included sediments and nutrients from the Sparrow model, mining, impervious surface, those all went into the condition score, and then combine that with a water score that reflects this idea of potential water availability that's really driven by more enduring features of the landscape and flow alteration, using McManamy and others model that the hydrologic alteration index that really considers and reflects the impacts of dam storage, of flow diversion, and impervious surfaces. So that's all wrapped up in the model. And then this is what it looks like for the Conterminous U.S. If we think about kind of the really dark brown areas as being the most vulnerable to climate change and the blue areas as being the least, you get the spread across the country, and you get a lot of average because some of these factors kind of average, cancel each other out. And I'll talk more about how we further pulled that apart. But now I'm going to turn it over to Analie, who's going to show you on the Resilient River tool what some of this looks like. So let me stop sharing if I can find my Zoom screen again. Oh,
thanks, Mary.
All right. Already
Hopefully
done.
everybody, can see the Resilient River Explorer tool, and I popped a link to the tool in the chat. So thanks, Mary, for that overview of the freshwater resilience model. I'm going to demo our Resilient River Explorer tool, which houses our freshwater resilience data, as well as some other information that Mary will talk about later in our presentation. This is our splash screen for the tool, so I'm just going to go ahead and hit enter. And I want to point you to this more info or feedback link. And this is a great place if you get stuck or have questions. We have the data downloads, ability to provide feedback or ask questions, report dam errors. You can download the detailed methods behind the freshwater resilience in the project report. So lots of information here. Hit OK. And then, of course, the user guide is over here for the tool. And you'll see there are 5 tabs that you can access in our Resilient River Explorer tool. In the interest of time and to reinforce what Mary just talked about in terms of the components of our freshwater resilience model, I'm going to focus on Explore the Data tab. And what this part of the tool lets you do is really dive into the freshwater resilience results and underlying components for an area of interest. And the first thing I want to note is you'll see these question marks on all these elements. So if you have a question, you can click on it and it'll provide more information about it. And then for our key tabs across here, we have some tutorial videos that you can watch if you prefer to learn that way. So for this demo, I'm interested in learning more about the freshwater resilience of a river that my family and I really enjoy paddling in North Georgia. So this is how I would go about doing that. First, I find this diagram right here really helpful for understanding where I am when I'm exploring the freshwater resilience components. So these are the key components that went into the freshwater resilience score. And then in green are the metrics that we use to calculate these components. And then in red are kind of source data sets that are available in the tool for you to help interpret the different metrics. So if you're ever wondering where you are in the whole scheme of freshwater resilience, this is a helpful diagram. So I'm going to close out of that. And then the next thing I do is turn on the toggle buttons for additional metrics and source data. And again, this just lets you dive deeper into understanding and interpreting the scores and components for freshwater resilience. Lastly, I'm going to expand this map layers component, and I'm going to turn on states, our river dams, and rivers. So it'll help me orientate where I am. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Now, you can get to where you want to look at the resilience for a place by zooming in or doing a search. I'm going to search, and instead of doing a river name, I'm going to actually type in the community where we put in to paddle. That's Ellijay in North Georgia. So I'm going to X out of that. I'm going to zoom out just a tad. And so this is the Kusawati River in North Georgia that we really enjoy paddling. And again, we start up here and we go until we get to the big lake now. And I want to understand, I can see that looks like it's average for resilience. And if you need to be reminded of our color scheme, you can look at the legend and zoom down here. So the key thing to know is when you click on a spot in the map, I'm going to click here. It's going to limit the map extent to the functionally connected network of that HUC 12. And if you don't like that, you can turn this mask button off and see the surrounding area. I'm going to keep it on to help us focus. And the other key thing about this Explore the Data section is this is really allowing you to start at the top and step through the components. So wherever you click in this set of options, the display of the map will change. So right now I'm at the topmost freshwater resilience, and I see my score is again average. But if I want to understand why this particular HUC 12 scored average, I can expand and go into the components. So if I click on physical score, again, I can see it scored average, and I want to understand this more. I can look at the 2 components of the physical score, which are condition and connectivity. So let's take a closer look at condition. I'm going to expand the caret there. And I'm going to see that there are two metrics here. There's naturalness and the cumulative water quality index. So let's take a look at naturalness. I'm going to click on that, and I can see that my HUC 12 interest scored slightly above average for naturalness, and so did some of this other HUC here for the Khoury. And the naturalness really refers to the naturalness of the land cover in the floodplain and riparian area, as well as in the watershed. And here is where I might want to take a closer look at why did it score slightly above average. So I can turn off the resilience results here by clicking this button, or I could change the transparency. I'm just going to turn it off. And then I can turn on the land cover. And I can see right off the bat, this is our national land cover data set. We used the 2019 vintage when we were doing the analysis, because that was what was available at the time. And I can see that this area is indeed looking pretty intact and natural. This area's got a little bit of some ag, and this one definitely is a little more developed. And if I click on watershed naturalness and turn the resilience results back on, I can see the results make sense, especially from what I know of paddling this river. This area is definitely more remote and intact than this area here. So this is just an example of how you can look at some of the underlying data sets to better interpret some of the metrics. So I'm going to turn that one back off. And the other piece of the condition score is the water quality index. So if I click on that, now the map changes to reflect the water quality score for both the FCN and the individual HUC 12s. And I can open that caret and expand and see some of the underlying data sets that went into that cumulative water quality index. So for Mary had mentioned, we used the Sparrow data. So I could look at suspended sediment, for example. I could look at the legend and see that, okay, some of these HUCs have, relative to others, a relatively high yield of suspended sediment per the Sparrow model. So I'm going to close that out, close this up, and close up condition as well. So let's now look at the other component of the physical score, which is connectivity. So I'm going to click on connectivity, and again, the map is changing to reflect what the unit scored for connectivity. I'm going to expand the caret here, and the two key components of connectivity are functional connectivity and diversity. I'm going to click on functional connectivity. Excuse me. And this particular metric was scored at that functionally connected network that Mary was talking about, the FCN. And I'm going to turn off this mask for just a second to get a sense. And I'm also going to turn on the functionally connected network boundaries, which are in this real dark, thick blue outline. So this really looks at the size of the network that's available to organisms in this area. And the dams really on rivers are what create these networks. I can see right off the bat that the functionally connected network of the Khoury is relatively smaller compared to, for example, this one. And if we expand out, there's some even larger ones further south. So now I can get a better sense of why it's scored below average for its size. So I'm going to put the mask back on. And I'm going to look at the other piece of the connectivity score, which is physical habitat diversity. Let me zoom in just a bit more. And I can see that for the Khoury, it scored slightly above average. That, again, makes a lot of sense to me from my paddles along this river. It's got a lot of topographic diversity. In fact, this portion of it used to have some of the best whitewater rafting or whitewater Class 4 rapids in the southeast and before this dam and lake were built. And so I see that I can then look at diversity in terms of temperature class diversity. And then I can turn on some underlying data sources to help interpret that, or macro habitat diversity. So for example, I could turn on gradient and see, yes, this definitely looks like it has a diversity of river gradient. We have got everything from moderate to moderate high and high. And again, this tracks with my knowledge of this particular system. So again, just one example of how you can use some of these underlying data sources to help interpret these scores of the metrics, and then ultimately how they were rolled up into the final component scores. So I'm going to close out the physical score here. And the other major component of freshwater resilience is the water score. So if we click on that, again, the map's going to change, and now it's reflecting the water score for my HUC. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go and dive deep into the components of the water score, but hopefully this gives you a taste for how you can use the Explore the Data section to learn more about the resilience of a system that you're interested in, and also just to understand how the different pieces come together to arrive at our final freshwater resilience score. So I'm now going to hand it back to Mary, who's going to talk about how we use the freshwater resilience results with a data set about recognized freshwater biodiversity to develop a conservation framework for freshwater systems.
Great, thanks, Analie. And I unfortunately lost my internet connection. So
oh no, I'll share.
But we have the backup, so if you could share and take me to slide 11, that would be perfect.
No problem.
Y'all are so prepared with your backup plans. I appreciate that very much.
Yep, can't take it for granted, even in a big city like Chicago. All right,
let me
great.
put in presentation mode for you.
Okay. All right. So while she's doing that, so we're going back to where we left off. As you can see, as I pointed out before, a large section of the country is in average resilience. And as we looked at this map and we thought about, well, how are we going to actually use this to inform where we do conservation? One way that we wanted to look at it is, well, where are the areas that are the most resilient? And because that makes sense to invest our conservation areas in places that will be resilient to climate change. And what areas are also maybe close to being resilient that with some restoration attention could be resilient. And we also wanted to represent freshwater biodiversity. So if you could go to the next slide. So we wanted to start with areas that had been identified through expert processes as recognized for their biodiversity value, rather than doing a ground up new analysis of biodiversity. So we used the freshwater ecoregional portfolio sites that had been identified through our 15 years of ecoregional planning that involved hundreds of agencies or their organizations as a starting place. And then we also had the state wildlife action plans for some states that had identified freshwater areas. We supplemented that with critical habitat for anadromous species, as well as information from NatureServe on concentrations of areas where there's really irreplaceability for rare species. So all of that's what's reflected in this map. And then next slide, please. We overlaid that with the freshwater resilience. And so now you can see that the average areas, there's more discrimination among those. So there's some that are average that are really important for recognized biodiversity. So having that as a background, we put together the Freshwater Resilient and Connected Network as a place for us to start, at least focus our conservation efforts. And the first thing we did was say, okay, we're going to take all of those areas that were above average for resilient. So if you could click, you'll see that that's about 18% of the country. If you just advance, it'll show the different percentages. There you go. And then we took those areas that, like I said, need restoration but are close to being resilient. So that included areas where we need to restore condition, flow alteration, and connectivity. So keep clicking, Analie. There you go. And then you'll also notice to the west that there's areas that are green, and those are also areas that would be resilient except for they were low in terms of potential water. So we included those as areas where we need to verify water. And altogether, that represents about 36% of the country. So this is the Freshwater Resilient and Connected Network. It's our analog to the terrestrial resilient connected network, although obviously put together in a different way, but some similar principles about combining resilience with recognized biodiversity value. Okay, so we can go one more click and then on to the next slide. Okay, so we wanted to also talk about what this freshwater some of these terms are too similar to each other. The Freshwater Resilient Connected Network represents in terms of biodiversity and different types of river systems. So that's what this slide is about. So there's different categories that we looked at in terms of representation. The first being, how well are the rivers within the different freshwater ecoregions represented? So you can see about 60% of the ecoregions have at least 30% of the rivers that are captured in the Freshwater Resilient Connected Network, and 100% have over 30% of all of their perennial rivers reflected in the FRCN. In terms of biodiversity, we captured 70% of areas of recognized biodiversity and 70% of the areas that have concentrations of 10 or more rare species. We looked at free-flowing rivers as well, and also how it represented different freshwater habitats aside from river habitat. And what that is showing you is the solid areas are what's represented in the Freshwater Resilient Connected Network. And then the hashed areas are if we also included the terrestrial resilient connected network, how well we captured all of the spring and seeps that we know about, groundwater dependent wetlands, all wetlands, lakes and ponds, riparian areas. So that's what's in the Freshwater Resilient Connected Network actually captures. Okay, so back to Analie to talk about more functions of the Resilient River Explorer.
Great, thanks, Mary. So for this portion of the demo, I'm going to focus on the Assess a River tab. So I'm going to click on that. And just a note, when you go through these different tabs, wherever you were previously is going to be reflected. For the Assess a River piece of the tool, this allows you to summarize the freshwater resilience and freshwater resilient and connected network, or FRCN, for a river of interest. In this case, I'm interested in looking at the Altamaha. I'm going to stick to Georgia here. So I'm going to, and it'll zoom into a flow line. If I click on the flow line, there, I see, okay, this is the Altamaha, so this is the river I want to look at a summary of. So I'm going to click select this river, and what it's going to do, let me close my legend here. It's going to show me the functionally connected network and all of the HUC-12 units that intersect the Altamaha River and its tributaries. So it's a very large system, as you can see, goes from the coast up to the metro Atlanta area. And now that I've selected that river, I can look over here on the summary and see that there are 46 functionally connected networks that intersect the Altamaha River watershed. And again, those are those thick dark blue lines. So if I zoom in here, I can see that, oh, there's some small FCNs which score lower for resilience because there's less connectivity and opportunity for organisms. And then I can see there's some really large FCNs that have a lot of above average resilient areas. I can also scroll down a bit further and see of all these FCN HUC-12 units, how many were in the different freshwater resilience classes. So for example, 30% were slightly above average for resilience, about 19% were above average, and almost 40% were average. It's just some helpful summaries about your river of interest. If I continue down here, I can now get a summary of the freshwater resilient and connected network. And again, you can click or hover over a part of the chart and it'll tell you how many units were in the different categories. And to visualize the RCN, freshwater RCN, I can turn this button on. And right now we're looking at a 2-class summary, and that's just distilled the freshwater resilient connected network into either protect, which is the dark blue, or restore, which is the lighter blue. And then if I wanted to look at that more detailed 5-class summary, I can click here. And let me turn that back on. And I can get a little bit more information about what's going on in those restore units. I can see several of them. Flow is a limiting factor for resilience, whereas in others, some of these appear. Reconnecting, so dam removal, making the network longer would increase the resilience of that particular FCN. So this is a helpful way to understand more about a river of interest. One other thing I want to note while I'm on this section is you can go down to the map layers, expand that, and I'm going to turn on that freshwater recognized biodiversity data set that Mary was just talking about. And again, this was a key part of creating the freshwater resilient and connected network. And I want to note 2 things. One, you can see actual, what the source of the data was, whether it was a freshwater ecoregional plan or state-based or additional other data source. And then the other thing I want to note is, in general, you had to have freshwater recognized biodiversity to be in the FRCN unless you scored far, highly above average for resilience. And so you can see here, these particular watersheds were above average for freshwater resilience, but they don't have recognized biodiversity, but they're still in the FRCN. Now, if you scored slightly above average, you would have to have freshwater recognized biodiversity to be in the FRCN, and you can see that if I turn off the FRCN. So, for example, these light blue watersheds scored slightly above average, but they don't have recognized biodiversity, at least in the data set that we've compiled. Again, if you have local knowledge that that could be good candidates for inclusion, then that you should bring that to bear, but they're not in the FRCN because we don't have recognized biodiversity there. So I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to scroll back up, and I just want to point, there's also this opportunity tab, and I'm not going to, in the interest of time, go through this, but if you are interested, it's got some really cool functionality where you can look at recommendations for how you can increase the resilience of these units. And while I'm here, I want to also just take a moment to look at the terrestrial tab. And again, this is going to keep where I was on the screen. And what this tab allows you to do is look at the terrestrial resilience and the freshwater resilience together. And essentially, the terrestrial resilience are analog to the freshwater resilience and what we worked on first. But let me click on the map so we can actually, there we go, see it, and then go to the FCNs here. This is summarizing the freshwater resilience for different units. The terrestrial resilience. And just if you're not familiar with terrestrial resilience, I'll orientate you very quickly. Our green pixels are those that we expect to be more resilient to climate change because they have a lot of topographic diversity, a lot of microclimates, a lot of options for species, and they're well connected. In other words, they're not impeded by anthropogenic land cover uses so that species could hopefully access all those microclimates. So again, areas in green we expect to be more resilient to climate change, areas in brown more vulnerable. Let me close that out. So let's say we're interested in understanding the terrestrial resilience and freshwater resilience for an area. I'm going to zoom in up here. I see a big area of green. So I just want to click here. And wherever I click is going to get summarized for terrestrial resilience. So if I click on this HUC, I can see that its average terrestrial resilience is pretty high. It's above average, and then you can get the breakdown of the categories by hovering over the chart. If you scroll down, you can get more information about our terrestrial resilient and connected network, or RCN, and then how some of the key pieces of that, the climate flow in particular. And then if I wanted to understand the terrestrial resilience for the FCN of this HUC 12, I could click on the FCN tab and see how its terrestrial resilience looks. And then you can also look at the floodplain of the HUC 12 and see how it scored for terrestrial resilience and the other elements as well. And then you can look at the floodplain for the whole functionally connected network and see how it scored. And one thing that might be of interest, I could scroll down here and I want to look at, I see this area has high terrestrial resilience in the floodplain. I'm going to scroll down and turn on an additional map layer to help me out here. I'm going to turn on the freshwater RCN2 class, and I see that, so this area scores high for both terrestrial resilience and freshwater resilience. In fact, the strategy recommended here is protect. And then I can turn on our secured lands data set, and I see, oh, okay, this already has some securement here. If you click on it, you can see more information about that particular secured area. And I can think about maybe would protection be a useful strategy here. So I'm going to stop here so we have enough time for our final section of the presentation, in which Mary is going to talk about the idea of how secured is a freshwater system. So hopefully this gives you a sense of some of the different elements that you can explore with both terrestrial and freshwater resilience. So Mary, I'm going to pop over here and do that. And there you go.
Thank you, Analie.
Sure.
Pretty smooth given all this. Okay, so from the outset, we wanted to be able to not only look at where are the more resilient areas, but also answer the question, how well conserved are they? And so we started to think about, well, what do we mean when we say how well conserved? And then what information can we use to actually map that? And so we set about thinking about, well, what are the mechanisms that protect freshwater systems? And also, how would we combine that with resilience? So what this slide is showing is that we actually thought we should keep those things separate. We don't want to just combine it all together into one value, because that would not give us really enough information. And what we're interested in terms of protection, and when we're talking about that, is the protection against future degradation or future threat. And then the other part of that is, what's the resilience of the system? We might have thought about that as condition maybe in the past, but we're kind of updating that to bring a climate lens to that. So those are the two factors that we want to think about in terms of conservation status. And then you could also think about those as two axes and really, okay, so we could identify those systems that are resilient that have enough protection. Those are the resilient that lack protection, or those that have protection, but maybe they lack resilience, or maybe both. And as we started to work on these protection mechanisms and mapping them, we also found out that American Rivers and working with conservation science partners were also engaged with the same question. And so wanted to acknowledge the work and sharing of information with them and their approach, because really I think our approaches were very similar and also very informed by each other. So if you're familiar with that American Rivers work, you'll probably see some similarities, but we made a couple of different choices about how we ultimately measured protection. So we had criteria for thinking about protection. First of all, we wanted to think about it in terms of each of the key ecological attributes of freshwater systems. Now, we didn't say that it had to protect all of them. That would be the ideal, but we wanted to at least, include things that protected at least one. They needed to be spatially specific at the reach scale so that we could map them. They needed to provide long-lasting protection and be something that's consistently applied. So these are the different, oh, yeah, Analie, you're driving. I'm thinking I'm driving the slides. But anyway, if you just scroll through, you can bring down all of the different mechanisms, including wild and scenic river designations, outstanding national resource waters, critical habitat. And then we also looked at the value of conservation land. So while protected areas don't necessarily protect fresh water because the water's flowing through them, they do provide habitat protection, and they do provide overall protection in terms of the more protected area in a watershed, the more it helps to regulate water quality and flow. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Thanks. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a quick example from the Merrimack River in Missouri, and you can see where it's located there in the Ozarks. You could go to the next slide. So this shows you those specific designations, which ones occur in the Merrimack. This is pretty typical, where it's kind of some of the reaches have these designations and many of them don't. And then if you go to the next slide, we can look at how the conservation lands provide some protection value. Where the arrow is pointing on the left is where Merrimack Springs Park, State Park is. And so I use this to just talk about yes, it is a great river to float. I grew up in Missouri and spent many weekends on this river, which is why I chose it. And the local protection that's given is we measured that, so you can see, that there's directly adjacent to the river, there are some patches of protected or conservation lands. And then, but in that Merrimack Springs example, not much protection of the actual watershed. So that would score low for the regulating function, which you can see on the right. And it's either gray, where it got no value, or it's, low. As we move downstream and start to pick up the areas that are protected by the Mark Twain National Forest, the regulating function score, which is that contributing area analysis, goes up. And again, we're trying to account for the protective value for water quality and flow. Okay, you can go to the next slide now. So this is showing the way that we scored protection. So across the top there are the key attributes. We were able to account for hydrologic regime, connectivity, water quality, and habitat. We didn't feel that these designations specifically provided protection for biotic composition. So that's one difference with the American Rivers CSP analysis, is that they did say that there was value for biotic composition. But you can see kind of the relative scoring. I won't go into the details here, but happy to share this, and we'll be adding this to our report so that you can see the details. And we will also be adding this to the Resilient River Explorer, but it's not yet on that tool. So the designations up top, the conservation lands, and the way that we scored that on the bottom. Okay, so let's look at the next slide and how this came out for the Merrimack. Here's the overall protection index, where we added those together for those different attributes. And then go ahead and click again, just so we can see the resilience map again. Yeah, great. So now we're going to combine those two concepts together in the next slide. And what you see is that we created these classes of areas that meet resilience and protection, that meet resilience, need protection, need resilience restoration, but meet protection, and so on. And so this is the outline of the HUC 8 for the Merrimack. You can see most of this area is resilient, but lacks overall protection. Now, one aspect that we weren't really able to account for that we want to in the next phase is other means of protection that may not show up in those formal designations or even in protected areas. So the Merrimack does have some management plans. There's a renewed effort to work with the many partners who've been working to conserve this river to really enact and implement more of those management plans. So those kinds of things, like the capacity to actually do river conservation and protect against future degradation, can also be reflected in that kind of local capacity. So that's something that we're interested in figuring out how to map. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So we wanted to show you what this looked like for the whole country. There's the designations and the local and regulating function protection on the left, and then how that sums together for all of CONUS. And then we divided it into 5 classes with from 0 all the way up to the top score, which was 15. And then you might be wondering, well, how does this look when combined with the resilience? So here is for all the flow lines, these different classes, again, kind of thinking of those 2 axes. Let's give you a second to absorb that. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the middle of the country is lacking in protection and needs some restoration. A lot of the areas that have both are, where we have Gap 1 lands and a lot of connectivity and topographic diversity. Okay, you could go to the next slide. This shows it for just the freshwater resilient connected network, and you can see kind of how it shakes out on the right in terms of the different quadrants. So about 22% of the FRCN falls into that category of being resilient and well protected, while 35% is of average resilience and not protected. So that would need both restoration and protection as strategies. Okay, so then we also took a look at how this matches up with the SECAS blueprint. And so that's on the left, showing everything but the low priority areas. And then there's the FRCN on the right. And if you go to the next slide, we can see kind of how those 2 things go together. So that's showing just the FRCN that overlaps the SECAS blueprint. So there's a lot of alignment. And I think for the non-marine areas, that represents 48% of the blueprint, which also includes terrestrial areas. So those would not necessarily get picked up. And then the next slide shows the overall conservation status of that overlapping area. So those are some of the ways that we can look at this information. And that is my last slide. And I had hoped to sneak in there the slide showing our website address, but I think Analie has provided some links in the chat. And I also see that there's a number of questions, but I didn't try to type while Analie was talking because it's too challenging on the phone to do that. But we have some good questions.
I understand. Yeah, the Q&A has been hopping in the chat, so I'd like to scoot us to that if that's okay. Thank you guys so much for that.
That would be great.
Presentation. So I'm going to kind of start at the top, and if you want to throw up the raise hand at any point, you can. But I'm going to just start with the chat. Lynette Brown asked if you could expand a little bit on why South Florida was excluded from their model. Mary touched on this a little bit in the chat, just saying it was due to the hydrography. But if you could just maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So the Sparrow model doesn't also include that portion of southern Florida because of all the challenges with how water is moved around in that area. And then our steering committee also felt like it was too challenging of an area that we could adequately represent with the data that we had at hand at a national scale. So, but we do have attributes, as Mary noted, for that area, with the exception of some of the water quality and flow.
Okay, awesome. There have been a number of questions about the pathway to updating the model. Someone asked about, as new land cover becomes available, do you anticipate updating the model? And then folks have asked a number of questions about, as conservation work to remove barriers and improve stormwater and all these types of actions are happening, is there a pathway to updating these models so that those changing conditions will be reflected?
Yeah, Mary, I can take, or you go for it.
No, you take it. I just had one. I'll just add one thought if you don't say it.
Okay. Yes, we really want to come up with a way to develop, update this going forward. One of the really tricky pieces of this, as most any of y'all working in freshwater know, is the dam data, the dam data. It's really hard to. So we're hoping continue to partner with SARP, who's really been leading on cleaning up and getting the dam data available to folks, that we can do updates maybe on an annual or biannual time frame going forward, but it's complicated and it's not something that we are going to be able to implement in the immediate future.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And I'll just add one thought on that, which is the underlying resilience model is what's really challenging for us to update, because there's a lot of integration of the factors as we go. But the overall freshwater resilient and connected network, we can easily override. So we actually did make some improvements since our first release, because there were some areas that we had thought were dams that were actually shoals. There were some biodiversity areas that people felt like were underrepresented. So the model, the freshwater resilient connected network, is something that's a little easier to adjust. And we will probably keep doing that. And I'm sorry if you're hearing, are you hearing background noise from me? I'm going to mute. Okay. My phone's cutting it out. All right. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, and appreciate the shout out to SARP. We also love SARP so much. They're such an important partner and a big foundational partner for a lot of our aquatic information in the blueprint as well.
Absolutely.
So I'm glad y'all are also working with them. So a couple of questions about kind of the underlying resilience model. We had one question when you talked a little bit about the terrestrial resilience that's used in this analysis. I'm assuming that's also including the coastal component of the terrestrial analysis, or was it only like resilient terrestrial sites that y'all were using?
Yeah, so that terrestrial part is separate from the freshwater resilience. And we unfortunately have not integrated the sea level rise aspect of our coastal resilience with the freshwater resilience, but it is something that maybe down the road we might be able to incorporate. So we don't look at saltwater intrusion or tidal marsh drowning in this.
That's helpful, thank you. A kind of a related question is about whether permanence of flow is incorporated within the freshwater connected network piece.
So we do have a flow alteration metric that's based on work from Ryan McMahon and others, the hydrologic alteration index. And I can, I don't have it handy, but there's the paper was published in Nature from which we use the index. And it looks at flow alteration. And we've also talked about thinking about how to incorporate some of the environmental flow work that like Sustainable Rivers and others do. And because the flow alteration index doesn't necessarily pick up that work because of when the data set that it's based on, the time frame for the reference flow data. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Mary, did you have anything?
Well, I was maybe because of the word permanence of flow. I think also that it was Lynette that asked that question. I would really recommend that if you're really interested in that you look at the report, because it provides a lot of detail about how the potential water availability was calculated, because that's probably where permanence of flow is more reflected. As you guys probably know, like I would say the groundwater piece of the model is probably the coarsest really for us in this, and because it's just the most difficult to characterize, especially nationally. But we did make an effort to really think about what systems are more likely to be driven by groundwater, and what information could we use to assess how that groundwater connection has been altered. Our aspirations are ahead of the data. I'll just say that. If you're familiar with the GRACE data, it's pretty coarse, but But we did do some deep thinking, and Arlene developed a map about groundwater potential that I think is worth looking at, and that's all described in the methods report, which you can get from the Resilient River Explorer or from our CRCS website. If you go to crcs.tnc.org, to the freshwater page, there's easy links there to the report, to the tool, to a one pager, to a Q&A or FAQ kind of document.
Thanks. I think I have two more I'm going to try to squeeze in. I have to wrap up with a quick preview of next month. So one other question was, what's the difference between the freshwater RCN2 class and the freshwater RCN5 class to include source data?
So it's basically just the representation. It's the same footprint. It's just how we represent it. So the 5 class just gives more detail about the limiting factor for resilience, for why it's in the restore category. And it could be because it has a flow challenges, connectivity, condition. So that's the difference.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming the answer to this is
restore and
no.
protect.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Got it.
Go ahead.
I'm assuming the answer to this is no, but are municipal stormwater systems included or accounted for in this?
No, we just have impervious surface to try to get at. Yeah.
There was someone who was looking to get a copy of the slides, and I'd like to post those to our page as well. If you wouldn't mind just emailing those to me, Joy, I've made a note of your email, and I can hook you up with those slides after we finish today. That would be awesome. Thank you. So I am going to just selfishly snatch back the sharing here and wrap us up. Next month's web forum will again require registration. I had the link queued up, but now I just copied Joy's email and now I've lost it. I'm going to put it in the chat. This is the link to register. That's not right. I'm sorry. I'm having copy paste issues. In a minute, I will put the link to next month's webinar to register in the chat. It's going to be focused on the Blueprint Explorer, our kind of easy to use online viewer to explore the blueprint. And we've made a number of changes over the last year in response to user testing, kind of as part of our commitment to this lean startup process of improving and learning from our users. So I'm going to be giving a live demo and some background on what we've changed with the Explorer, so you can all see the latest and greatest. So that'll be February 20th. And then our main update from SECAS staff, I just wanted to highlight for everyone that the SECAS Goal Report, Recent Trends in Southeastern Ecosystems, is on track for release this month. Rua talked about this back in November on our web forum, talking about the latest Blueprint and Goal Report update. So hopefully you've already seen a sneak preview of what's to come, but we'll have an updated PDF report and a brand new interactive story map with spatial dashboards that really breaks down the data on these trends and a number of indicators representing ecosystem health, function, and connectivity. So you can kind of see how those trends vary at a much finer spatial scale than you've ever been able to see in the past. So we're super excited about that. And I always like to end telling people how they can get more involved in SECAS. You can sign up for our newsletter on the footer of any page of our website, secassoutheast.org. Connect with your staff. Our contact information's on our website. We'd love to have you explore the blueprint and let us know how it's working for y'all. And so I'll just close with a huge thank you to Analie and Mary for their fantastic presentation. Obviously, we had a ton of people here, a ton of great engagement in the chat. So obviously a lot of interest in this data set, and appreciate you persevering through technical issues to make this happen today.
Thank you for putting up with it.
Yeah.
Oh, no problem. We're always here to roll with the flow. So thanks again. Appreciate you all tuning in. Oh, and I promised that link. I swear I'm going to get it. Here you go. Here's the link to register for next month's web forum. Better late than never. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Hope everyone's New Year's off to a good start. And we'll see you next month. Bye.
Bye.